I'll give $750,000 to the one person who can reach my son." The words echoed through the grand ballroom, silencing every conversation in an instant. More than 200 guests turned toward the stage, unsure whether they had heard correctly. At the center of the room stood Victoria Reynolds, one of the most successful CEOs in America, a woman whose name appeared on magazine covers, business podcasts, and television interviews. She had built a technology empire worth billions of dollars. Investors trusted her judgment. Employees admired her leadership. Competitors feared her determination. Yet on that evening, none of those accomplishments seemed to matter. Standing beside her was 8-year-old Ethan Reynolds, a small boy in a navy sweater who stared quietly at the floor, seemingly unaware that every eye in the room was fixed on him. Victoria tightened her grip on the microphone and forced a smile that could not hide the exhaustion in her face. "I'm serious," she continued. "The money is yours if you can help him connect." A ripple of confusion spread across the audience. Some exchanged curious glances. Others looked at Ethan with sympathy. The charity gala had been organized to support children with communication challenges, and many respected specialists were in attendance. Therapists, educators, researchers, and advocates filled the room. Most assumed Victoria had invited them to speak about awareness or fundraising. No one expected such a startling challenge. For a moment, the room remained silent. Then whispers began to spread from table to table. Why would a billionaire offer that much money? What could possibly be so difficult? Victoria looked down at her son. Ethan never reacted to the noise around him. Crystal glasses clinked. Conversations resumed. Cameras flashed. Nothing seemed to pull him into the world surrounding him. For years, Victoria had searched for answers. She had traveled across the country, met with renowned experts, and invested countless hours trying to understand her son's unique way of experiencing life. Every recommendation had been followed. Every possibility had been explored. Still, she often felt as though an invisible wall stood between them. She loved Ethan more than anything she had ever built. Yet there were days when she wondered if he knew how deeply he was loved. As she looked across the audience, hope and heartbreak battled inside her. "Tonight," she said softly, her voice trembling for the first time, "I'm not speaking as a CEO. I'm speaking as a mother." The room grew quiet again. Even those seated furthest from the stage could hear the emotion behind her words. Ethan remained motionless beside her. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, several guests began rising from their seats. A child development specialist stepped forward first. Behind her came a behavioral consultant, then another expert, and another. Each seemed confident they might succeed where others had failed. Victoria watched them approach with cautious optimism. Maybe this night would be different. Maybe someone in this room would finally discover what everyone else had missed. But as the first volunteer moved toward Ethan, no one noticed the elderly janitor quietly pushing a cleaning cart along the far side of the ballroom, listening more carefully than anyone realized. The first specialist approached Ethan with the confidence of someone who had spent decades studying child behavior. She knelt beside him, introduced herself gently, and showed him a collection of colorful cards designed to encourage communication. Several guests watched with hopeful expressions. Victoria held her breath. For nearly 3 minutes, the specialist tried different techniques, carefully following methods that had helped many children in the past. Ethan never looked up. He continued staring toward the floor, calm but distant. Eventually, the specialist stood and offered Victoria an apologetic smile before returning to her seat. A second expert stepped forward almost immediately. He carried a small tablet loaded with interactive programs used in schools across the country. The audience leaned forward as he demonstrated sounds, images, and simple activities intended to capture a child's attention. Ethan remained exactly as he had been before. Not a glance, not a gesture, not even the slightest indication that he noticed the screen. The expert thanked Victoria and quietly stepped away. One after another, respected professionals volunteered their time. Some spoke softly. Others tried games. A few shared stories, hoping a familiar tone might spark a reaction. Each attempt ended the same way. The room slowly shifted from excitement to discomfort. People who had arrived expecting inspiration now found themselves witnessing something far more personal. This was not a challenge that money could solve in a single evening. This was a mother carrying years of disappointment behind a carefully maintained smile. Victoria knew every expression she was seeing. She had watched doctors lower their eyes after promising breakthroughs. She had sat through evaluations that produced more questions than answers. She had listened to experts describe possibilities while secretly praying for certainty. There had been moments when progress seemed close enough to touch, only to disappear weeks later. Through it all, Ethan remained the center of her world. Every business success felt smaller when she returned home and struggled to connect with the person she loved most. She remembered birthdays where guests sang and Ethan sat quietly by himself. She remembered school events where other parents chatted proudly about milestones while she searched for signs that others might overlook. A smile, a glance, a moment of connection. Sometimes those tiny victories felt more valuable than any corporate achievement. Across the ballroom, the atmosphere grew heavier with every failed attempt. Some guests began whispering that the challenge might be impossible. Others questioned whether anyone should continue trying at all. Yet Victoria refused to withdraw the offer. Deep inside, a small part of her still believed that somewhere, somehow, someone might reach Ethan in a way no one else had. As another specialist stepped away unsuccessful, Victoria looked down at her son. For a brief second, she wondered if bringing him here had been a mistake. Then she noticed something unusual. Ethan was no longer staring at the floor. His eyes had shifted slightly toward the far side of the ballroom. It was only a tiny movement, so small that no one else seemed to notice. Victoria followed his gaze. Near the wall, the elderly janitor had paused beside his cleaning cart, and for the first time all evening, Ethan appeared to be watching someone. Victoria stared across the ballroom, unsure whether what she had just seen was real. Ethan almost never followed movement in crowded places. Even during family gatherings, school events, or medical appointments, his attention usually remained locked inside a world that no one else could fully understand. Yet now his eyes appeared fixed on the elderly janitor standing beside a cleaning cart near the far wall. The moment was so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. Victoria might have missed it too if she had not spent years studying every expression, every gesture, and every tiny change in her son. Before she could process what it meant, another specialist approached. This one was a nationally recognized consultant who had spent years working with children facing communication challenges. Several guests quietly applauded as he stepped forward. If anyone could succeed, many believed it would be him. He greeted Ethan warmly and carefully introduced a structured activity designed to encourage engagement. The consultant spoke with patience and confidence, giving Ethan time to respond. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Nothing happened. Ethan never looked at the materials. He never acknowledged the questions. His attention seemed to drift back toward the opposite side of the room. The consultant eventually lowered his hands and offered Victoria a sympathetic nod. By now, the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, people had viewed the challenge as an opportunity. Now it felt like they were witnessing a deeply personal struggle unfolding in public. Conversations became quieter. Smiles disappeared. Several guests looked away, uncomfortable with the growing sense of helplessness. Victoria thanked each volunteer sincerely, but inside she felt the familiar weight returning. It was the same feeling she experienced after every promising lead ended in disappointment. Hope would rise, only to fade again. She had learned to hide that pain from investors, employees, and reporters. Tonight it was becoming harder to hide. A woman seated near the front table leaned toward her companion and whispered something. The companion glanced toward the janitor and shook his head with a faint smile. A few others noticed him too. The sight seemed almost amusing. While respected experts had failed one after another, the elderly employee continued quietly doing his job, as though none of the evening's drama involved him. Victoria followed Ethan's gaze once more. The janitor was not speaking. He was not performing any technique. He was simply standing there. Yet Ethan continued looking in his direction. The realization sent a strange chill through her. Then, unexpectedly, the janitor turned as if he sensed someone watching him. For a brief moment, his eyes met Ethan's from across the ballroom. No dramatic reaction followed. No miracle occurred. But Ethan did not look away. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. Across the room, the janitor seemed surprised by the attention. He glanced around, perhaps assuming the child was focused on something else. Then he returned to his work. Victoria could not explain why, but for the first time all evening, she found herself paying less attention to the experts and more attention to the man everyone else seemed to overlook. And deep inside, a question began to form. What was it about this stranger that had captured Ethan's attention when nobody else could? Victoria could not stop watching the elderly janitor. While guests continued discussing the failed attempts, her attention remained fixed on the quiet man near the wall. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and a worn uniform that blended into the background of the ballroom. Nothing about him suggested expertise. Nothing about him hinted that he belonged at the center of an event attended by executives, specialists, and influential donors. Yet Ethan continued glancing in his direction. It was enough to make Victoria curious. She stepped down from the stage and walked toward one of the event organizers. "Who is that gentleman?" she asked softly. The organizer followed her gaze and seemed surprised by the question. "Oh, that is Michael Carter," she replied. "He works here. He has been part of the staff for years." Victoria nodded and looked back toward him. Before she could say anything else, a nearby guest overheard the conversation and let out a small laugh. "You are not thinking about asking the janitor to try, are you?" he said. Several people around the table smiled politely. Another guest shook her head. "You have had some of the best specialists in the country up there tonight. If they could not help, what is he supposed to do?" The comments were not cruel, but they carried the quiet certainty that some people mattered more than others. Victoria did not respond. She simply looked at Ethan again. Her son's attention remained unusually focused. Across the room, Michael appeared completely unaware that anyone was discussing him. He continued organizing supplies on his cart, moving with the calm routine of someone finishing another ordinary shift. A few minutes later, another expert volunteered. The audience offered polite applause, but the enthusiasm that had filled the room earlier was gone. Most people already expected the outcome. The specialist tried several approaches, speaking gently and giving Ethan plenty of time. Once again, nothing changed. When the attempt ended, a heavy silence settled over the ballroom. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying hope for too many years without knowing where to place it anymore. Then she noticed Ethan looking toward Michael again. This time the gaze lasted even longer. Something inside her told her not to ignore it. She crossed the ballroom before she could second-guess herself. Guests watched with growing curiosity as she approached the janitor. Michael looked startled when he saw the famous CO walking toward him. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "is everything all right?" Victoria offered a tired smile. "I was wondering if you would do me a favor." Michael glanced around, clearly confused. "I can certainly try." Victoria hesitated for a moment. She knew how unusual the request would sound. Around them, conversations began to fade as nearby guests sensed something was happening. "Would you be willing to come meet my son?" she asked. Michael blinked in surprise. Before he could answer, several people exchanged skeptical looks. One man quietly muttered, "This should be interesting." Another guest shook his head as if the idea made no sense at all. Michael looked from Victoria to Ethan and then back again. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he gave a small nod and slowly began walking toward the stage. Every conversation in the ballroom seemed to stop as Michael Carter approached the stage. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Moments earlier, nationally recognized experts had stood where he was now walking. They had arrived with credentials, research, and carefully developed methods. Michael carried none of those things. He wore a simple maintenance uniform and comfortable work shoes that had clearly seen years of service. Several guests exchanged uncertain looks. A few appeared amused. Others simply looked confused. Victoria stood beside Ethan, wondering whether she had made a foolish decision or the most important one of her life. Michael stopped a few feet from the boy and offered a polite smile. "Thank you for asking me," he said quietly. "I should tell you, I am not an expert." Victoria nodded. "That is all right." Michael looked at Ethan for several seconds. Unlike everyone else who had approached him that evening, he did not immediately begin speaking. He did not present a device. He did not ask questions. He did not attempt to guide Ethan through an exercise. Instead, he simply observed. The ballroom remained silent. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable some people became. One guest checked his watch. Another quietly shook his head. It looked as though nothing was happening at all. Then Michael did something unexpected. Rather than standing over Ethan, he slowly lowered himself into a chair nearby. He positioned himself at the same level as the boy, leaving several feet of space between them. He kept his hands relaxed and his posture calm. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation, no performance. For the first time all evening, Ethan did not look away. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. Michael noticed it too, but his face remained composed. Nearly 30 seconds passed without a word. The room grew so quiet that guests could hear the faint hum of the ballroom lights. Then Michael leaned forward slightly. Not enough to invade Ethan's space, just enough to speak softly. What happened next was so subtle that many people almost missed it. Michael said a single word. One word. No speech. No explanation. No special technique. Just one quiet word spoken directly to Ethan. Several guests frowned, unable to understand what had been said. Others leaned forward in their seats. Victoria herself barely caught it. The word seemed almost ordinary. Yet the moment it left Michael's lips, something changed. Ethan blinked. It was a small reaction, but unmistakable. Victoria froze. Michael remained perfectly still. The entire ballroom seemed suspended in time. Ethan slowly lifted his head. Not all the way, just enough for his eyes to move toward Michael. A wave of disbelief spread across the audience. One guest gasped softly. Another sat upright so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes before she even understood why. For years she had searched for signs like this. Tiny moments that others might overlook, but that meant everything to her. Ethan continued looking at Michael. The connection lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt larger than anything that had happened that evening. And as stunned whispers began spreading through the ballroom, only one question remained. What was the single word that had captured Ethan's attention when nothing else could? No one moved. No one spoke. The reaction had lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to leave the entire ballroom in stunned silence. Victoria could barely breathe. She had spent years watching for moments like this, and now she was afraid that even the slightest interruption might cause it to disappear. Michael remained seated exactly where he was. He did not celebrate. He did not look toward the audience. He kept his attention on Ethan as though nothing unusual had happened. The boy continued looking at him. For most people in the room, the moment might have seemed small. For Victoria, it felt enormous. She remembered specialists who had spent hours trying to gain Ethan's attention. She remembered appointments that required months of waiting. She remembered promises, theories, and treatment plans. Yet here was a maintenance worker who had spoken one quiet word and achieved more in seconds than anyone else had managed all evening. A murmur spread through the crowd. Guests exchanged confused glances. Some looked toward Michael. Others looked toward Ethan as if trying to confirm what they had just witnessed. One of the specialists near the front table leaned forward, unable to hide his curiosity. Another quietly removed his glasses and stared at the stage. Michael finally spoke again, his voice calm and gentle. "Hello, Ethan." The boy blinked once more. Then something happened that made Victoria's eyes fill with tears. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. It was a simple movement, but it was directed toward Michael. Not away from him. Toward him. Victoria pressed a hand against her mouth. She knew how rare that was. Michael still did not rush. He seemed to understand that trust could not be forced. Instead, he sat quietly, allowing Ethan all the time he needed. Nearly a minute passed. The room remained completely silent. Then Ethan did something that left Victoria frozen. He lifted his eyes fully and looked directly at Michael's face. A collective gasp swept across the ballroom. Even the guests who had doubted Michael moments earlier now stared in disbelief. Victoria felt tears slide down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. She could not. Her attention was locked on her son. For years she had dreamed of seeing him connect with someone this naturally. The sight felt almost unreal. Michael offered a warm smile. "There you are," he said softly. Ethan continued watching him. The connection held. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Longer than anyone expected. Victoria noticed that her son seemed calm, comfortable, and curious all at once. There was no pressure between them. No demands. Just understanding. Around the ballroom, people began looking at Michael differently. The skepticism was gone. In its place was a question nobody could answer. Who was this man? How had he accomplished what so many experts could not? Victoria found herself wondering the same thing. Because whatever had just happened was not luck. It was not coincidence. And as she looked at Michael's peaceful expression, she realized there was a story behind this moment. A story that nobody in the room knew yet. Victoria slowly walked toward Michael, afraid that speaking too loudly might break the fragile connection that had formed between him and Ethan. The ballroom remained unusually quiet. Even the guests who had spent the evening whispering now seemed reluctant to interrupt what they were witnessing. When Victoria finally reached them, she lowered her voice. "How did you do that?" she asked. Michael looked at Ethan before answering. "I'm not sure I did anything special." Several people nearby exchanged skeptical looks. After what everyone had just seen, that explanation felt impossible. Victoria shook her head gently. "Please," she said. "I need to understand." For a moment, Michael seemed uncertain whether he should say anything at all. Then he glanced around the room and noticed that many of the guests were watching him with the same question in their eyes. He let out a slow breath and looked back at Ethan. 20 years ago, he began quietly, "I had a little boy named Daniel." The room became even stiller. Michael's voice carried no bitterness, only tenderness. Daniel experienced the world differently too. He rarely spoke. Most days he preferred silence. People often assumed he did not understand what was happening around him. They were wrong. Victoria listened carefully. Something in Michael's expression had changed. He no longer looked like a janitor standing in a ballroom. He looked like a father remembering the most important chapter of his life. "When Daniel was young," Michael continued, "I spent years trying to get him to meet me where I was. It never worked. Eventually, I realized I needed to meet him where he was instead." Several guests lowered their eyes as they absorbed the meaning of those words. Michael smiled faintly. "Once I stopped trying to change him and started trying to understand him, everything became different." Victoria felt her throat tighten. The sentence struck her harder than she expected. Michael looked at Ethan again. "Daniel taught me that connection is not always built through instructions, questions, or expectations. Sometimes it begins when someone feels truly seen." The ballroom remained silent. Nobody seemed interested in the prize money anymore. They wanted to hear the rest of the story. Victoria noticed tears in the eyes of several guests. Even some of the specialists appeared deeply moved. "The word I said to Ethan," Michael continued, "was the same word that once caught Daniel's attention when nothing else could." He paused for a moment, not because the word itself was magical, because it carried a memory of patience, trust, and understanding. Victoria felt another tear slide down her cheek. For years she had searched for solutions, strategies, and answers. Yet listening to Michael, she began wondering whether the thing her son needed most had never been a solution at all. Maybe it had been something far simpler and far more difficult. Understanding. As she looked at Ethan calmly watching Michael, one realization became impossible to ignore. The connection everyone had witnessed was not the result of expertise. It was the result of experience, empathy, and a lesson learned through a father's love. Victoria remained beside her son, listening to Michael's words long after he had finished speaking. Something inside her was shifting. For years, she had approached every challenge the same way she approached business problems. She gathered information, hired experts, built plans, measured results, and searched relentlessly for solutions. That mindset had helped her build a company worth billions. Yet standing in that ballroom, she began to realize that Ethan had never been a problem to solve. He was a child to understand. The thought hit her with unexpected force. Michael noticed the emotion on her face and offered a gentle smile. "You love him very much," he said. Victoria laughed softly through her tears. "More than anything." Michael nodded. "I know." The simplicity of the exchange somehow made it even more powerful. Around them, the audience remained completely engaged. No one seemed interested in checking phones or returning to conversations. The evening had transformed into something none of them expected. Michael looked at Ethan and spoke quietly. "People spend a lot of time trying to get children to enter their world. Sometimes the better question is whether we are willing to enter theirs." Victoria lowered her eyes. She thought about the countless schedules, appointments, evaluations, and goals that had filled Ethan's life. All of them had been motivated by love. Yet she suddenly wondered how often she had paused to simply sit beside him without expecting anything in return. Michael continued speaking in the calm voice of a man who had learned difficult lessons over many years. "Daniel taught me that progress often begins when a child feels safe enough to be exactly who they are. Not who everyone hopes they will become tomorrow. Who they are today." Several guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Even the specialists seemed deeply moved. None of Michael's words sounded revolutionary. In fact, they sounded remarkably simple. Perhaps that was why they felt so true. Victoria glanced at Ethan. To her amazement, he was still watching Michael. The connection remained gentle but unmistakable. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Peace. Not certainty. Not a guarantee about the future. Just peace. She no longer felt desperate to force a breakthrough before the evening ended. Instead, she found herself appreciating the small miracle already taking place. Michael had given her something more valuable than a solution. He had given her a new perspective, a new way of seeing her son. As the ballroom sat in thoughtful silence, Victoria realized that the most important lesson of the night had nothing to do with communication techniques or expert knowledge. It was about connection, real connection, the kind that begins when one human being feels understood by another. And as she looked from Ethan to Michael, she knew that this lesson would change far more than a single evening. It would change the way she loved her son for the rest of her life. For several moments, nobody in the ballroom spoke. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with uncertainty and disappointment. Now it carried gratitude. Victoria looked around the room and saw the same realization reflected on countless faces. Everyone had arrived expecting to witness expertise. Instead, they had witnessed humanity. She turned toward Michael and took a slow breath. "I made a promise tonight," she said, "and I intend to keep it." The audience immediately understood what she meant. The $750,000 reward still waited exactly where it had been placed at the beginning of the evening. Michael's eyes widened slightly. "That is very generous," he said, "but I cannot accept it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Victoria looked genuinely surprised. "You earned it." Michael shook his head. "No, what happened here was never about earning money." He glanced toward Ethan. "If I accept anything, I would rather it help families who are still searching for understanding." The room fell quiet again. Victoria felt her throat tighten. Even after everything that had happened, Michael was thinking about others. She looked at Ethan, who remained calmer than she had seen him in a long time. Then she made a decision. Turning back toward the audience, she lifted the microphone once more. "Then that is exactly what we will do." Every eye in the ballroom focused on her. "Tonight, I am establishing the Daniel Carter Family Foundation." Michael froze. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Victoria continued. "The foundation will support children with communication challenges and provide resources for parents who need guidance, support, and hope." Tears filled Michael's eyes. Across the ballroom, guests began applauding. The applause grew louder and louder until nearly everyone was standing. Yet Victoria was not looking at the audience. She was looking at Michael. "Your son changed your life," she said softly. "And through you, his story will help change the lives of countless others." Michael lowered his head, overwhelmed by emotion. For years he had quietly worked behind the scenes, unnoticed by most people who passed through the building. Tonight, he had been seen. More importantly, Daniel's legacy had been seen. As the applause slowly faded, something unexpected happened. Ethan shifted in his chair and looked toward his mother. Victoria immediately knelt beside him. Her heart raced as she met his gaze. For a brief moment, mother and son simply looked at each other. No expectations, no pressure, no desperate hope for a specific outcome. Just connection. Victoria smiled through her tears. It was the most beautiful moment of the evening. Later, many guests would remember the reward, the foundation, and the remarkable story they had witnessed. But Victoria would remember something else. She would remember learning that love is not measured by how hard we try to change someone. It is measured by how willing we are to understand them. And as she left the ballroom that night with Ethan by her side and Michael walking nearby, she realized that the greatest gift she received was never the breakthrough everyone celebrated. It was the reminder that sometimes the people who change our lives are the ones the world almost overlooks.